So Baruch Hashem, we're back to our normal routine. Baruch Hashem, as I told you 2 weeks ago, last week, my oldest Einikel got married, and we had a beautiful simcha. And I say that if it is a decree, im nigzar aleinu levatel min haTorah, it should only be for simchas. And Baruch Hashem, we are back to our normal routine of shiurim, b'botei knesses and botei medrushas. We should always share simchas, and we should always share Simchas HaTorah. This week's Parsha, Parshas Chukas, starts off with TUMAS Weiss. And the topic we will be discussing today is a very, very critical halachic issue, which is very relevant, and very many KOHANIM are troubled by this issue, and we will discuss the basics today. TUMAS KOHANIM, especially in hospitals, when there are so many KOHANIM amongst us who either accompanying their wives when they come to give birth to babies, or bikacholim, or when they themselves need some medical procedures which are not life-saving procedures. So we're not dealing with pikuach nefesh. So what would be the heter for a kohen to walk into a hospital today? Because all major hospitals today, usually we're dealing with huge buildings, and statistically, people pass away in hospitals. Hospital is not a very pleasant place. For some it is, but for the few, not for the many. And so, especially hospitals in Israel, when the vast majority are Jewish, so kivrei akum einom mitamim ba'oyel. That's a Gemara Yevamos Daf Samach Aleph. And we're dealing with TUMAS oil. But in Israel, when the majority of patients are Jewish and meses matama ba'oyel, so to what degree could we find leniency for a kohen to come into a hospital? So first of all, before we actually start today's shir, I would like to dedicate the shir le'ilui nishmosai of the shver of one of my closest and dearest friends. So this week, Rosh Chodesh Tammuz is the Yortzeit of Reb Chaim Abba ben Reb Yosef Yehuda. He should be a Meretz Yosef for the wonderful Orlinsky family in Teaneck, New Jersey, and Yenuach B'Sholom HaMishkovoi, and the entire family should only know Simchas and Nachas. So this week's Parsha, as I said, starts off with TUMAS Weiss, TUMAS Maga, TUMAS Masa, TUMAS Oil. And we will be dealing with a very clear halachic discussion regarding kohanim that need to visit a hospital. So the bigger the hospital, the more chance you have to encounter TUMAS Weiss. So in Shari Tzedek, the hospital which I am very closely associated, statistically there are about 4 ptiras, 4 deceased people every day. And statistically, the mace is in the hospital for anywhere between half hour and an hour, half hour, 45 minutes before the body is taken out of the building. So, which means that 2 hours, 2.5 hours throughout the mace lace, there probably is TUMAS Weiss. But there is a sign outside, and usually when there is a nifter in the hospital, there is a sign which is an Azorah LaKohanim. So the question would be, could a kohen walk into the hospital for an extended stay when there was no sign when he went into the hospital? So to what extent does he have to be choshesh that maybe somebody might pass away while he is in the hospital? But the problems of TUMAS KOHANIM are not only the deceased, lo aleinu, but also amputations and nepholim. And there are no signs regarding nepholim and amputations. So it really is a problem coming into a major hospital today. Hospitals usually have the open door policy. I spent some time in a hospital in America, and I did not see that there. Most of the doors there are closed, but here there is an open door policy, because the directors of hospitals feels it's more friendly when doors are open. The doors to the rooms are open, the doors to the machlakot are open most of the day, and that exacerbates the problem because tumah spreads by any open door or open window from one room to the other, into the corridor, from the corridor into the other rooms. And Tumas Mace travels at the speed of light, not the speed of sound. It's instantaneous. And therefore, that is the crux of the problem. So, the opinion of the Ravid, and this Ravid is a big controversy, a big halachic controversy. The Ravid appears in two different sources in the Sugas al-Rambam. Hilchos Naziris Perek Halacha Tezvav and Hilchos Ovel Perek Gimel Halacha Zayin. The Ravid says that a person that was already exposed to Tumas Mace, a kohen that was exposed to Tumas Mace, there is no more issa to expose himself once again to Tumas Mace because he's Tomei anyway. So according to the Ravid today, Tumas Mace L'Kohen would be irrelevant because when a baby is born in the hospital, and he usually spends a few days in the hospital, so we could assume that in those few days he was exposed to Tumas Mace. So he is already Tumah. And even if he went to the mikveh, that won't do him any good, because as long as we don't have Eifer Porav, the Pora Aduma, there is no way to purify yourself from Tumas Mace. So since that baby was born till the end of his days, according to the Ravid L'Choyre, there is no Isser. And the Mishnah Lamelech in Hilchos Ovel Perek Gimel argues that the Ravid is a Das Yochid. But that definitely is not the case. Obviously, the Mishnah Lamelech wasn't aware that there are very substantial Rishonim of the great Rishonim that have the same opinion as the Ravid. The Rosh Halochas Ketanas Dinei Tumah Siman Vav says that the Rabbeinu Tam is of the same opinion of the Ravid, and the Rabbeinu Tam was Rosh V'Rishon LeBaalei HaTosfos. The Halochas Gedoros, quoted by Shilta Geboira Mararif, says the same. Once a kohen is Tomeh Tumas Mace, as long as he is not Oile Mitimosoi, there would be no additional Issur to expose himself once again to Tumas Mace. The Lechem Mishnah in Hilchos Naziris quotes Rashi Masechet Nazir is the same. So the Mishnah Melech definitely isn't right when he argues that the Ravid is a Das Yochid. It still is a minority opinion. It still goes against the Rambam and more significantly against the Shulchan Aruch. But it is an opinion. And there's a major discussion between the Achronim whether we could be mitzarev the Ravid to a svek sveket to look for room for leniency. So the Dogal Mervova is the Goas of the Noide B'Yehuda and Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh Esim and Shinayim Beis. Toich Kedei Dibo, he makes a psak and he retracts. So B'tchilas Advorim, the Dogal Mervova writes, the Ravid, we could be mitzarev to a svek sveket. V'kach nahagu, writes the Dogal Mavovo, to be mitzarev the Ravid, if we have any other suffix, then we could judge and we could argue that it's a svek sveke, because according to the Ravid, once a kohen is tumah, there would be no additional isser to be metama atzmai once again. And then the Dogal Mavovo writes, all that Ravid means to say is that there is no malchus, but there definitely is an isser rabbanan and maybe even an isser dioraisa. And the Chassam Sofer has a very interesting tshuva, Yoreh Esim and Shin Lamed Vav and Tshuvas Chassam Sofer. And the Chassam Sofer tells the story that he accompanied his great Rebbe Reb Nosson Adler. When Reb Nosson Adler was in Prague and he went to visit the Noide B'Yehuda, and this was the discussion of those two great Gedolim. The Noide B'Yehuda argued, according to the Ravid, there would be no Isser of Tumas Kohanim B'Zman Hazeh. And Reb Nosson Adler argued, no, the Ravid only refers to Malchus, but it's an Isser Dioraisa, even though it is not clear. If there would be an Isser Dioraisa, why wouldn't there be Malchus? But the Chassam Sofer says that Reb Nosson Adler caused the Noide B'Yehuda to retract and to regret his previous psak. And in Dogal Mavovo we find the Mishnah Rishona and the Mishnah Achroina as well. However, many great Achroinim learned the Ravid Kipshutoi, and that definitely seems to be the case of Shittas Rabbeinu Tam and the other Rishonim that I quoted. So the Mishnah Lamelech, even though he doesn't paskin in accordance to the Ravid, because in his opinion the Ravid is a Das Yochid, but his understanding of the Ravid is there would be no Isser at all. And that is also very clear in Shuvas B'Kiva Eger. Tinyona Simen Yudches. So according to many Achronim, we could be mitzaref shittas haravid if we have additional sveikes to reach a conclusion that it would be a svek sveike and svek sveike lekula even by an isur diuraisa. So as I explained, the Ravid is not a das yochid. And in Klolei Hairua, Simen Reish Mem Beis, one of the Klolim is, B'shas Adchak, if we're dealing with an Issa D'Rabbanan, one could rely on a das yochid. So in our quest for leniency, after we learn the Shittas HaRavid, we need to look for either additional sveikes or an assumption that we're dealing with a D'Rabbanan and not a Diurais. What else could come into account? The Shachan Simen Shianayim Beis writes that Tumas Oil Min Torah is only Ba'oil HaMeis, when the Kohen and the Meis share the same domain under the same roof. But the din that a poiseach tefach is mavir tumah from one room to the other, a window or a door, that is only a din d'Rabbanan and not a din d'Uraisa. That is the Shach's opinion in Shian Ayin Beis. And there is a tshuva in Pnei Yehoshua. The Pnei Yehoshua alludes to the tshuva in Sukkah Daf Chavav, but we don't have Shalas Tshuvas Pnei Yehoshua. Actually, we do have Shalas Tshuvas Pnei Yehoshua, but it's not from the Pnei Yehoshua. So the famous Pnei Yehoshua on Shas, one of the greatest of the Achronim, his grandfather was the Shalas Tshuvas Pnei Yehoshua. He also wrote a Sefer al Shas, and that Sefer is called Meginei Shloima. Why Meginei Shloima? To us, it might seem a bit strange, but the Meginei Shloima writes in the introduction to a Sefer that he's an Einikel of Rashi, and therefore he sticks with Rashi. And he wrote a Sefer Meginei Shlomo. Rashi was Reb Shlomo Yitzchaki, and he defends Rashi because he's his descendant, he's an Einikel. So he wrote a Sefer to be miyashav all the kashas of Tosfos and Rashi. An interesting concept of protection. He's an Einikel of Rashi, so he wants to stick with Rashi and stand up for him. So that is the Meginei Shlomo. He was one of the great poskim in his generation, and he wrote the Shalas Tshuvas Pnei Yehoshua. But the tshuva I am quoting is from the second Pnei Yehoshua, his Einikel, the famous Pnei Yehoshua al Shas. We do not have tshuvas from Pnei Yehoshua number 2, or maybe number 1. But in the Sefer Hu Eshkol, with Nachal Eshkol, who was a Rav in Frankfurt the Main many years after the Pnei Yehoshua, in his Sefer at the end of the Nachal Eshkol, Sefer Hu Eshkol, he printed a tshuva Tachas Yodoi from the Pnei Yehoshua. And the Pnei Yehoshua paskins in accordance to the Shach, that Tumas she'oiver mamukum lamukum al yedei poseach tefach is only mid'Rabbanan. And the Shach in that same Sifkoten, in that same paragraph, writes, Soif Tumah Lutzeis is definitely mid'Rabbanan. So Masechet Ohalois, there is an additional concept. If a mace is in a room and the door is closed, locked, we still say that the tumah passes through that door. Because if that is the only door, and it is predestined that the mace will go out of the room through that door is considered as if open, and tumah will pass through that door even if it is closed. And that is the concept that Chazal define as soif tumah lotzeis. If there are different doors in the room and we have no inkling, no idea which door we might go out, then we do not say soif tumah lotzeis. But if there is only one way out, even though the door is closed, it is considered as if open, and tumah will pass through that door. So the Shach writes 2 arguments. Even if the door would be open, it still would be a tumah d'Rabbanan. If the door is closed, sof tumah lotzeis definitely is mid'Rabbanan. And the Pnei Yoshua supports the Shach on both counts. However, the Magen Avraham is Choylek al Shach twice in Hilchos Shabbos, Shin Yud Aleph and Shin Mem Gimel. Magen Avraham quoting the Shach and Yerodea and rejecting the Shach. And most of the Achronim rejected the Shach. And the Avnei Nezer has a most interesting expression. He writes, "Kol yoma yoyisi mitztayer al divrei hashach." Eich, the greatest of the Gedolim, could say such a dove bottle. Well, you got to be an Avnei Nezer to dare to say what the Shach writes is such a dove bottle. And I was so gratified, writes the Avnei Nezer, when I saw that the Chochmas Sodom and Klal Kuf Nun Tes and Yerodea, the Sefer of the Chayudim and Yerodea, as you probably know, is Chochmas Sodom. Chochmas Sodom, Klal Kuf Nun Tes writes that the kavanah of the Shach is only regarding Soif Tumah Lutzeis. So if he was so baffled by the Shach, I don't know how he was comforted by the Chochmas Sodom, because the Shach clearly makes two different and distinct arguments. Tumah she'oiva mecheder l'cheder aladei poseach tefech is midarabonon, and Sof Tumah Lutzeis is the Rabbonon. And there are two different halachas. So when the Chochmas Sodom says that the Iker Kavonas Shach is only the second argument, well, after all, the Shach makes two different arguments. So anyway, this is one of those rare cases. Yes, it's a Shach, and the Pnei Yeshua paskins in accordance to the Shach. But most of the Achronim write that the Shach is a Teimei Gedolah. So first and foremost is the Magen Avraham. But after the Magen Avraham, the Chsam Sofer Shin Lamed Tes, the Chochmas Sodom Kuf Nun Tes, the Avnei Nezer, as I quoted. Most of the Achronim reject argument number one. But argument number two of the Shach definitely carries far more water. And Soif Tumah Lutzeis, most of the Achronim agree with the Shach. We are dealing with a Tumah D'Rabbanan. So, if we put together the Ravid with the Shach, most of the time, when an iftar is in a room, the door is closed. Out of respect for the family, the door is closed to that room. And when we're dealing with nefolim and amputations, pathology, usually the door is closed. So when the door opens, Tumah gets out, but that is only for a moment, till the door is closed. Soif Tumah Lutzeis is midarabonon. So if we're mitzad of the Ravid to a suffix, then it would be a sveika d'Rabbanan and not a sveika d'Uraisa. If we accept the ruling of the Pnei Yeshua that paskins in accordance to the Shach on account number one, it would be a trei d'Rabbanan. But even if we say the Chsam Sofer and the Chochmas Sodom and the Magen Avraham are right against the Shach, and the Shach is a Taima, because there seem to be rayas. I don't want to go into the details of Dinei Tumah V'Tara, Masechtas Orlois, but most of the Achronim reject Shach number one, and they adopt Shach number two regarding Soif Tumah Lutzeis. Then there is far more room for leniency. That is basically what we're dealing with. Now, an additional argument would be, if it's a suffix, then it's a suffix Tumah B'Shus HaRabim, because the concepts of the Shus HaRabim and the Shus HaYochid regarding suffix Tumah B'Shus HaRabim Toher, suffix Tumah B'Shus HaYochid Tomei, have nothing to do with the ideas of the Shus HaRabim and the Shus HaYochid by Shabbos. Shabbos makes no difference how many people are out there. If there are mechitzas, it's a Reshus HaYochid. But regarding Tumah V'Tahara, doesn't depend on mechitzas. It depends, is it a public domain or a private domain? And a hospital would be a public domain, because there are always many people in the hospital, people walking in and walking out, especially when you're not going into the machlakot, but rooms where patients are and where families come to visit. So if it is a suffix, would we say suffix Tumah B'Shus HaRabim Sveiker Torah, and there would be no Issa for KOHANIM? Some achronim maintain, and this is a major discussion, some achronim maintain, Sofek Tuma B'Shus HaRabim, Sveikei Torah, Sofek Tuma B'Shus HaYochad, Sveikei Tomei, is only when we're dealing with Dinei Tuma V'Tahara. But when we're dealing with the Issa of TUMAS KOHANIM, that is a Sveikei the Isura. That has nothing to do with the rule, Sofek Tuma B'Shus HaRabim, Sveikei Torah. It is only when a person passed in a place which there is a Sofek Tuma. Was he Nitma or was he not Nitma? We're dealing with a Yisroel, not a Kohen. Is he Tuma or Torah? It is there that Chazal decree and say, if it's a Shus HaRabim Sveikei Torah, if it's a Shus HaYochad Sveikei Tomei. But when we're dealing with the heter for a Kohen, is he permitted or prohibited to going into a place where there's a Sofek Tuma? That is defined as a Sveikei D'Oraisa, and a Sveikei D'Oraisa L'Chumra. So the rules that B'Reshus HaRabim Sveikei Torah, B'Reshus HaYochad Sveikei Toma do not apply. That is the opinion of the Noid B'Yehuda, in Tzlach and some other Achroinim. In many tshuvas that I wrote on this sugya, I maintain alocha l'maisa, no, even when we deal with Tumas Kohanim. It is a Sveikei D'Oraisa. But first we must decide, is this a Mokum Tuma or it's not a Mokum Tuma? And if the basic rules of Tuma V'Tahara are Sofek Tuma B'Shus HaRabim Sveikei Torah, then there would be no prohibition for a Kohen going into that place. However, that is only if we define a certain space as a Sofek Tuma. And once again, if it's a major hospital, most of the day they probably would be deceased. If it's not a huge hospital, we could assume that most of the day there aren't mesim, and a Kohen would not be exposing himself to Tumas Meis. However, if he plans to be many hours or days in the hospital, then the chances are that he is exposing himself to Tumas Meis. Shuras Shai was the Av Beis Din in Sighet 150 years ago. Very choshev a sefer. And in Shuras Shai, Chelek Aleph Siman Tov Kuf Nun Tes, he deals with this very same question. Could a Kohen visit the hospital? Now, hospitals in Chutz La'aretz, especially many years ago, the vast majority of patients were Goyim. And there weren't huge institutions in which hundreds and hundreds of patients were there together. There were small local units, so the problem was a far lesser problem than it is today. But the arguments are interesting. So Shuras Shai, Chelek Aleph Siman Tov Kuf Nun Tes, he deals with the question, could a Kohen visit a family member or a friend in a hospital? And he writes two svaros for leniency. One, Cheskes Chai. So we would assume that nobody died, nobody's dead in there, because every person has a Cheskes Chai. And the basic source of Cheskes Chai is in Gittin Daf Chof Ches. Eishes Kohen that left her husband at home, or her husband, the Kohen, traveled to Medina Sayam, she could eat Truma, because we assume that he's still alive. We haven't heard from him. He didn't send an SMS, he sent no emails, we haven't heard from him, but we assume he's alive because a person has a Cheskes Chai. Until he proves differently, we assume that he is alive. So the Shuras Shai writes Cheskes Chai. And he also makes an interesting argument based on Hilchos Toiloim. What does Hilchos Toiloim have to do with Hilchos Tumas Meis? So on Hilchos Toiloim, Siman Pei Dalet, Tirozov, Sivkot Yud Zayin, the Taz brings the Marshal. If we have a dish and we find 3 flies in the dish, then we just throw out the flies. And we don't say if there are 3, there are probably many more. So the Marshal differentiates between 2 different types of bugs. If it's bugs that infest fruits or vegetables, and they grow in the fruit or vegetable, then Cheskas Gimel Pa'omim is valid. Because if there are 3, that means this fruit was infested. But if we're dealing with flies, flies come from the outside and not. So even if we find 3 flies, why would we assume that there are more? There happen to be 3 flies that fell into the soup, but why would you assume there are more? So the Tas Paskins, if it's me'al meka'osi, if these are insects like flies that just fall into a dish from outside, then the fact that we find 3 doesn't necessitate we should be choishes there are more. So the Chura Shai, what a strange svara. He writes, well, Mason aren't bred in a hospital. They just happen to die there. And therefore, it's like flies that come from the outside. There would be no chazakah. And I think both svaras are svaras rechoikes b'yosa. They don't really stick and don't really make sense in our discussion. First of all, cheskas chai. Would cheskas chai mean that people don't die? Obviously, at some stage they do. Cheskas chai is relevant when you're dealing with an individual. We know that he was alive when he left us. We would like to know whether he's still alive. So Chazaka says, yes, that's the din of Chazaka de Mekora. If we know that a girl wasn't married and there's a suffix in the Kiddushin, we say Cheskas Pnuya. That is the basic concept of Chazaka de Mekora. But would Cheskas Pnuya say there are no married women in this town? Of course there are married women in this town, and that has nothing to do with Cheskas Pnuya. So in the same way, Cheskas Chai cannot say there are no deceased people in this hospital. Cheskas Chai, like Cheskas Pnuya, like any other Chazukah de Meikora, is relevant when we're dealing with an individual person, or an individual thing, or individual phenomena, or whatever it is. But Cheskas Pnuya doesn't say nobody got married. Cheskas Chai doesn't say nobody passed away. And therefore, Cheskas Chai is not relevant to our question. We're not dealing with any individuals. Are they still alive or not? We're dealing with a hospital. Are there niftorim in this hospital or not? And for the same reason, I don't think the question here is Cheskas Gimel Pa'amim. If the question would be, yes, 3 people passed away today, does that mean we have to be choshesh that many more will pass away? No. It has nothing to do with the number 3. Cheskas Gimel Pa'amim is irrelevant when we're dealing with natural phenomena. And in my Sefer Bava Basra, and in different sources in my Sforim, I defined what Cheskas Gimel Pa'amim is all about. Some things just happen at random, what we call coincidence. So if a shor was mazik, if a shor hurt another animal once, we say that was just by chance. But if he did it 3 times, we decide this is a dangerous animal. So as long as any phenomena happens once or twice, we do not conclude that this is the nature of things. It might be coincidental. But when any phenomena happens 3 times, then we assume these 3 times are not coincidental. They have something in common. Obviously, this is the nature of things. And we find more than 10 different sugyas in Shas which are based on this same idea. Tinok shemesu echov machmas mila. A baby after circumcision passed away. A younger brother was born. We hope that what happened with baby number 1 will not happen with baby number 2. And there is no reason to be choishish it will happen. But if 2 children passed away, then we are careful with child number 3. So Badina Nefoshes, 3 zimna hava chazoka. Badina Momenes, tlat zimna. That's the Machlokes Rebbe and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. So we find this concept by Shor Nagach. That is the only source which is in the Torah. And in Mishnah we find it, Katlanis. and many different sugyas. The source of this sugya is in Yavamis, Daf Samach Beis. And the same is in Dinei Teloim. If we find 3 bugs, we say they didn't just happen to be there. Obviously, this dish is infested. So the Rishal argues it depends whether there is any room to assume that this is common phenomena. This is the nature of things. But if a mosquito just fell into the dish, that must be coincidence. And my argument is, well, there would be a difference whether it's a mosquito, a moth, or a fly. Flies come from the outside, but flies are attracted by food. So if you find 3 flies, you need to assume maybe there were more, because we could find some common nature to the number 3. Mosquitoes aren't attracted to soup. They're attracted to our dismay. Some of us would wish they would be attracted to soup. They're attracted by us. They are attracted by living people. So if you find 3 mosquitoes in a dish, you throw them out, and there's no reason to be choishish. Maybe there were more, because there is no common nature to the number 3. But so it doesn't really matter whether it's from within or from without, whether the food was infested or the flies were attracted to the soup. If there is room to assume that these 3 have something in common, then you have to be choishish for more. So that is the basic concept of Cheskes Gimel Pomim. So if there were 3 people that died in a hospital, that definitely doesn't mean that there probably are more. Chas v'sholom, we hope that number 3 is enough. Because unless we're dealing with an epidemic. If it's an epidemic and there is infection, and then that is a different story. So, but I think the basic question has nothing to do neither with Dinei Teloim nor with Cheskes Chai. We are dealing with a concept of Rav and Miut. And if most of the time there is Tumas Mace in the hospital, that would be a problem for a Kohen to walk into that hospital. Everything we said up to this moment is based on Dinei Sfeikis. Either Sfek Sveike or Sveike Derabanan. One suffix would be, is there a mace in the hospital or not? The other suffix would be, Hayem alochike divrei HaRav or not. So that would be the room for Sfek Sveike. And the room for argument that we're dealing with, the Sveike Derabanan, is based on the Shach. Either Shach number 1, that Tuma moving from one room to the other through a Pesach Tefech is Midrabanan. Even the Achronim that reject that Svara, most of them agree that Soif Tuma, let's say if the door is closed, would be a Derabanan. So the 2 arguments are Svek Sveike or Sveike Derabanan. But this is argument number 3. Chazal were Mekel by Tumas Beis Apras and Tumas Meis Derabanan b'Mokei Mitzvah. We find this in Bavli and more so in Yerushalmi. And the Yerushalmi is extremely mekel by Tumas Meis. In Bavli, we find this kula only by Tumas Derabanan, by Tumas Beis Apras. In Yerushalmi, even by Tumas Meis Dioraisa, by Tumas Oil. And in Yerushalmi, we find that Chachamim were mekel by Tumas Mes for Talmud Torah, for Kibud Av Ve'eim, and many Achronim really are disturbed. If it's a Sveike Dioraisa, how, it's not even a suffix. If it's a Dioraisa, Tumas Mes, how could we be lenient for Kibud Av or for Talmud Torah? Would that be Esa Doichaloisasa? Very unreasonable. First of all, Tumas Kohen is an Esa Veloises, ein Esa Doichaloisasa Ve'esa. And it's not Be'idne, so it definitely wouldn't be Esa Doichaloisasa. Some Achronim say Tumas KOHANIM is a lav she'enoi shove bakol, and therefore it is yoser kal, being a lav she'enoi shove bakol, and therefore Chachumu were mekel b'mokoim mitzvah, which still would be a great chiddush. Most of the poskim don't paskin in accordance to the Yerushalmi, because in Bavli it seems to be clear that only by Tomei D'Rabbanan they were mekel b'mokoim mitzvah. But if we do assume that we're dealing with a Tomei D'Rabbanan, because even if there is a mace in the hospital, we could assume that most of the time the door is closed, and Soif Tumah L'Tzeis is only a D'Rabbanan, and we also hope that from that room where the nifta might be till where I am visiting, we hope that some door is closed along the way. So, Soif Tumah L'Tzeis is D'Rabbanan, and B'mokoim mitzvah, yesh lahakol. And therefore, if a kohen feels he wants to visit his wife who had a baby, Bikur Cholim is a mitzvah. If his parents are in the hospital and he wants to go visit them, if he needs to accompany his wife when she is having a baby, and it's her Yesu V'daita that her husband should be with her when she's having the baby, if you're dealing with a mokoim mitzvah, if it's kvod rabbi or similar situations, I think if we do not know with certainty that there is a mace right now in the hospital, there definitely is room for leniency based on all the different svaros and different yesaidas that we presented today. So today we had a very clear halachic discussion, and this year sometimes is lamdas, sometimes is halacha, kachi darko shel Torah, and today we deal with a very common question which many kohanim are troubled about, living in Eretz Yisrael, and some circumstances it is very hard to avoid going into the hospital, especially when these people themselves need medical treatment and medical attention. So if it's even a remote question of pikuach nefesh, then it's not a shaila. Pikuach nefesh doiche kol haTorah kolo. But sometimes we're dealing with elective surgery or procedures that definitely are not dealing with life-threatening issues, and there isn't even a remote pikuach nefesh, but nevertheless, we still need medical attention. So it definitely is a mitzvah. Caring for your body, v'nishmartam nefshesechem is a mitzvah, and b'mokoim mitzvah yesh lahakol, b'tumah D'Rabbanan, b'tumas KOHANIM, according to the Yerushalmi, even b'tumah d'oraisa, definitely b'tumah D'Rabbanan, and a sofek tumah D'Rabbanan b'mokoim mitzvah, v'adai sheyesh mokem lahakol. So this week's parsha is Parshas Chukas, and Parshas Chukas deals first and foremost with Tumas Meis, and Tahara mit Tumas Meis, Porah Aduma. And Porah Aduma is the example of Chazal, the most evident and obvious example of Chukim Chukakti Gzeres Gozarti Ve'enoch Reshus Lahara Rachareim. As Rashi brings, Lefi Shasot Nevo Mesroel Amoinim Es Yisrael, Ma mitzvah zu v'ma ta'am yesh bo, lefichach korei hakosov chuko, chukim chukakti, gzeres guzarti, ve'enoch ureshus lahara rachareihen. So many Sifrei Musar maintain that it is not only the chukim, even the mishpotim, in a way. Gzeres guzarti, ve'enoch ureshus lahara rachareihen. So Rashi explains, our Torah is divided in two different spheres, two different concepts, chukim and mishpotim. The mishpotim are the mitzvahs of sichlios, mitzvahs that make sense, mitzvahs that even if the Torah wouldn't say them, we would assume many of them. Even non-Jews are makayim many mitzvahs that are in our Torah. Maybe kibbud av v'em would be the most striking example. Every decent person would respect his father and mother. It is basic decency, basic civility, or geneva and gzeile. In every decent society, this is something which is unacceptable. So those are the mishpotim, the mitzvahs sichlios. But many of the mitzvahs are not mitzvahs sichlios, but they are purely gzeres hakosev, macholas asuros, and definitely Porah Aduma. So these are the chukim. Chukim chukakti, gzeres gazarti, ve'elach ureshus lahara rachareim. But Reb Chaim Evoloshin writes in Nefesh HaChaim, Tamei HaMitzvahs ad tachlison lo nesgalo l'shum odam yolam. And I think his emphasis is ad tachlitan. And the Goren writes to Shivim Punim LaTorah, and in each and every one of the Shivim Punim there are Tar Yag Sha'orim, Rechavim and Iyam. And the Torah has no gevul, and no limit, and no boundaries. And even the mitzvah sichliyos, the Mekabolim have different approaches and different reasonings and different explanations to each and every one of the mitzvahs. And in the days of the Rishonim, there was major controversy. That Rambam headed one camp, the camp that said we should try to explain mitzvahs. And Chelik Gimel of the Moreh Nevuchim, in its entirety, is dedicated to Ta'ama mitzvahs. Sefer HaChinuch followed in the footsteps of the Rambam, and in each and every one of the Taryag mitzvahs, the Chinuch writes not only Dinei mitzvah, but also Shoirish or Shroshei mitzvah, which is essentially Ta'amei mitzvahs. On the other hand, Shuvas HaRashba is very adamant and very angry. And the Rashba writes, we do not have to deal with Tamei HaMitzvahs. The Rashba quotes the Medrash. Chazal say, V'chi ma'ichbas lo l'HaKadosh Baruch Hu ben shoichet men hatzavar u shoichet men ha'orav. Lo nitnu mitzvahs elo l'tzarav ben hasabriyas. The Medrash saying, why would a Kadosh Baruch Hu mind whether we check from the neck or from the back of the head? Why would it make a difference? Lo nitnu mitzvahs elo l'tzarav ben hasabriyas. So the Rambam actually quotes this Medrash, and the Rambam writes, in Halacha we know that Maram al-Choda, and then we need to decide who's right and who's wrong, who is Nifsak l'Halacha and who is rejected. The same by Agadata, or by Midas Chasidus. The Rambam writes that Halacha is not in accordance to that opinion that says, Lo nitnu ha-mitzvahs elo l'tzarav ben hasabriyas. However, there's an interesting expression in Moreh Nevuchim in Perek Lamed Beis and Chelik Gimel. The Rambam writes, and I am not quoting the Lashon of the Rambam, because as beautiful and precise the Lashon of the Rambam is in Mishnah Torah, and the Rambam was an oman in expression, but the Lashon of the Rambam, as all early Jewish philosophers in their philosophical works, is very heavy and unfriendly. So, but the Rambam writes, I'm quoting him in my sprach, in Lashon Kodesh, the Rambam writes, Kol ha'noisen ta'am leprotei ha'mitzvahs einoi elo mishtagei shigaon gadol. That is more or less what the Rambam writes. But the Rambam heads the camp of those that are doirish ta'am dekro. And I think the Rambam means to emphasize protei ha'mitzvahs. We could explain klolei hamitzvahs, but not protein v'dikdukein. And each and every one of the Taryag mitzvahs has so much detail, and that is what halacha is about. Other dominations only have klolim, but in Yiddishkeit, lahav l'elef avdolas, the details make all the difference, and each and every one of the mitzvahs has details. And when you eat matzah, you're going to eat with the greatest Mesias Nefesh. But if you're missing 1 gram to a kazayas, it's futile. You did nothing. And you could have all the kavonas hari with your lulav. But if it's a hemnik, then you did nothing. And the Rambam says, there is no way to explain all the protei hamitzvahs, even though we could find reasonable explanations for klolei mitzvahs, but not for protein. So the Balei Kabbalah have more explanations than protei mitzvahs. But the basic rule is, chukim chukakti, gezeres guzarti, and we need to be mekayim the mitzvahs, lazis nachas ruach l'kodesh baruch hu. So just a week ago, or was it 2 weeks? No, our last year was about Torah Lishma, and we dealt with various different interpretations of what Lishma means, but essentially, Ta'amei mitzvahs have significance, but only to the degree and to the extent that they give us more simchas and mitzvah, more slavas, and more dvekis in the mitzvahs. So I do not recall whether it was a year ago or 2 years ago I dedicated the Shia to Ta'amei mitzvahs and their significance in halachic ruling. I assume that we already discussed this topic here. But what I would like to say at the end of this year, and this is bearing upon us in these days. Today was a very sad day, and Friday was a very sad day, and once again terror struck in the heart of Klal Yisrael, and a young girl was murdered in her bed at the end of the week, and a very, very choshev, a person was killed Friday, Erev Shabbos, a Talmid Chochem and a Tzaddik, and left 10 Yesayimim and Yesayimis, an unbearable tragedy. And that is part of our saga. That is part of our story. And that has been with us for the past 2,000 years in Golas and in Eretz Yisrael. As if b'demaya chayi. That is the nevuah of Yechezkel HaNavi. So in this week's parsha, there's an interesting interpretation in the Yalkut Shimoni. And the Medrash goes through all the psukim in the beginning of the parsha. V'yikcho olecho pora aduma. Poro Eli Yisrael. Aduma Eli Yisrael. Odmu etzem mepninim. Tmimu Eli Yisrael. Yoinosi tamosi. V'nosata Moisel Elozar HaKohen. Ze Yirmiyahu, who was a Kohen. Min HaKohanim asher ba'anasois. V'yoitzi yoitzel mechitz lamachne zaremes to Golas Bovel. The expulsion of the Jews from Eretz Yisrael. V'yoitzi yoitzel el mechitz lamachne. V'shochat oisel afonov b'nei tzidkiyahu. Shenishcheto le'einav. That is the remes v'shochat oisel afonov. V'soraf esapora. That is the remes to Sreifes Beis HaMikdash. And ultimately, V'lokach ze Nebuchadnezzar, Eitz Erez V'Eza V'shnitelo Ze Hananiel Mishol V'Azariah. And the Medrash explains all the details of this posuk, going through the story of Golas Yisrael. Chorb Mabayis, the pain of Tzidkiyahu, the Mesiras Nefesh of Hananiah, Mishol V'Azariah, and ultimately, V'osaf Zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ish Zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shenemar, Hashem Yishmechomo, Tor Zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shenemar, Toher Einayim Yir'o Yisbaro, Es Eifer HaPorah Eile Gulu Yisayim Shel Yisrael, El Mokem Toher Zeh Yerushalayim Yir HaKodesh, in the Geula Shleima. So the Medrash explains this entire parsha, from Sreifes HaPorah to Asifes Eifar. That is the story of our people, the story of Golas and Geula, of exile and redemption. And what I would like to add on to this Medrash, then on this pshat as well, Chazal say, Gzeres Gozarti, V'chuchim chukakti v'ein lechu reshus laharer achareihem. We are the chosen people. We are HaKadosh Baruch Hu's beloved ones. Not only his avodim, his bonim, his intimate family. So why do we suffer more than all the others? Moshe Rabbeinu asked the same question. And in Brochas Dav Zayin, Chazal say that when Moshe Rabbeinu asked HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what did he want to understand? What was he pained by and troubled by? Moshe asked Tzadik Veraloi, Rosha V'Toivloi. And to me it is clear that he didn't mean Ploini HaTzadik and Almoini HaRosha. Kodesh Baruch Hu bears upon Moshe Rabbeinu to be Goel Yisrael. Moshe turns to a Kodesh Baruch Hu. If I am destined to be the leader of Klal Yisrael in such a difficult period, and I feel their pain and their suffering, I think I should understand what's behind all this. And when Moshe wants to understand Tzadik Veraloi, Rosha V'Toivloi, Libi Yoimali, he is referring to the destiny and the story of Klal Yisrael. And there's a machlokes in the Gemara Reb Meir v'Reb Yosi, ha'im nana Moshe b'tvilosai, or lo nana, whether HaKadosh Baruch Hu responded, whether HaKadosh Baruch Hu shared with Moshe Rabbeinu the secret of tzaddik v'raloi, rosha v'toivloi. Machlokes Tanoim, whether nana Moshe lebakashosai. So if Moshe didn't understand, how could we understand? But this is our destiny. This is our story. And in our parsha, there is a remez to our saga. And when Chazal say, An Pora Aduma, Chukim Chukakti, Gzeres Gezarti, V'yenech Reshus Lahara Lacharei, and it also refers to the pshat that we find in Yalkut Shemaini. But we do have to feel the pain, and that is what is unique about Klal Yisrael. We are one family and one people, and we're all brothers and sisters, and when tragedy strikes, we all feel the pain. So we need to daven and do whatever we can to ease, to help. Shelo yashom eshoid v'sheva, she'HaKadosh Baruch Hu yerachem, and we should know no more tragedy. ShaKadosh Baruch Hu yishlach lanu Mashiach tzedkenu, sheyitkayem banu. V'osaf ish toher zeh HaKadosh Baruch Hu esreifas hapora ele goli Yisrael shel Yisrael al mokom tor zeh Yerushalayim yira kodesh bebias goyel tzedek b'mheiro v'yomeinu amen.